In most classrooms, getting the right answer kind of feels like the end of the road, right? You get a quick, good job and the teacher just moves on. But what if that's a huge missed opportunity? Today, we're going to dig into this really powerful teaching technique that has a pretty radical question. What should happen in that exact moment after a student gets an answer right?
Okay, so look at this. On the left, you've got the traditional reward, right? Simple praise. And hey, it feels good, but it basically shuts down the thinking process. But on the right, that's a totally different approach. It's a challenging question. And this simple little shift, well, that's the engine behind a technique that's all about making learning way deeper and, making it actually stick. And that really brings us to the core idea of this whole explainer. This question, it challenges the very foundation of how we even think about success in a classroom. It's suggesting that achievement isn't the finish line. Nope, it's the launchpad for the next challenge.
All right, let's dive in. First up, we're going to explore how this idea completely redefines the goal of learning. It's all about turning a correct answer from being, the end of the line, into the starting point for some seriously rigorous thinking.
So the formal name for this whole strategy is Stretch It. It's a really key technique from Doug Lemov's book, Teach Like a Champion. And the rule is super simple, but it's also kind of non-negotiable. The second a student is 100% correct, you don't stop. You immediately stretch them with a follow-up question that just ramps up the cognitive demand.
And this quote just nails the philosophy behind it, doesn't it? A correct answer isn't proof that a student is done, not at all. Instead, it's a signal. It's a sign that they are ready for more. It really is the key that unlocks that next level of intellectual engagement. Okay, so to really make this work, it requires a pretty fundamental shift in mindset. And I'm not just talking about for the student, this is for the teacher too. It's all about moving away from just, performing for a grade and really moving toward the genuine pursuit of mastery. What this technique does is completely reframe the whole idea of a challenge. See, in this system, getting a tougher question, well, it's not a punishment, and it's not some kind of trick. It's actually the ultimate academic compliment. It's a teacher saying, hey, I see you've mastered this, and I respect your brain enough to give you a more complex problem to chew on.
And this connects directly to all that amazing work by Carol Dweck on mindset. With a fixed mindset, a correct answer is basically proof that you're smart, so the effort just stops. But a growth mindset, which is exactly what Stretch It is trying to build, sees that same correct answer as an opportunity, a chance to earn a new challenge and get even smarter. Okay, so we get what it is. But the big question is, why does it work so well? Let's dive into the cognitive science a little bit and see what makes this simple technique so darn powerful for locking knowledge into our long-term memory. So what's happening here is this technique triggers a kind of four-step chain reaction in the brain. First, you get the success, that moment of high focus. Then, boom, the stretch question immediately jumps on that focus. This forces what we can call a metacognitive spark, where the student actually has to stop and analyze their own thinking. And the result of that whole effortful process, the knowledge just becomes way, way more durable.
And that word metacognition, it's absolutely key here. When a teacher asks something like, how did you know that? Or what's the rule that proves that's true? What they're really doing is forcing the student to practice thinking about their own thinking. See, it's not enough to just know the answer. You have to understand the path you took to find it. And that skill is so critical for becoming an independent learner.
From a pure memory perspective, this is just incredibly efficient. Think about it. It takes advantage of that really brief window of high focus you get right after you nail something. And instead of just shallow recall, it forces you to do what's called effortful retrieval. That's the gold standard for moving information from your short-term working memory into stable, long-term memory. All right, so we get the why behind it. Now let's get practical and talk about the how. Because honestly, the effectiveness of this whole technique, it lives or dies by the quality of that follow-up question. This isn't about just asking random trivia. Not at all. It's a strategic art.
A great teacher has this whole toolkit of different types of follow-up questions, and each one serves a really specific purpose. Like you see here, they can probe for the how or why to really test if the concept is solid. Or they could ask for an example in a totally different context to make sure that knowledge is flexible. They can even ask about common mistakes to build up a student's error analysis skills.
But there is one golden rule here. This stretch question has got to serve the main objective of the lesson. The goal isn't to go off on some interesting tangent, no matter how tempting it might be. The most powerful stretches are the ones that push students right toward the most complex application of the exact skill they're supposed to be learning that day.
Okay, now let's zoom out for a second. Because this isn't just a cool cognitive tool for individual students.
When you apply this consistently, it can become a powerful engine for equity and totally transform the culture of an entire classroom. And the research on this is just crystal clear. More than almost any other factor you can think of, holding high expectations for students is what drives their achievement. You might have heard of it as the Pygmalion effect. Basically, students tend to rise to meet the expectations that we set for them.
And this is where Stretch It becomes so incredibly important. It takes high expectations from being just a vague belief and turns it into a concrete, daily procedure. See, by making it a rule that any student who gets an answer right gets a harder question, it acts as a kind of guardrail against our own subconscious biases. It makes sure that every single student gets access to rigorous, complex thinking every single day.
Now, of course, it's not without its risks. Some critics worry that these kinds of procedures can just lead to students focusing on compliance. And that's a fair point. The key to avoiding that is all in the framing. The teacher has to be more of a co-learner in a dialogue, not an interrogator. And to avoid anxiety, the whole classroom culture has to celebrate challenges as opportunities. And, like we said, to prevent cognitive overload, the stretch always has to align with the core objective.
So, we end right back where we started, with a question that kind of reframes everything. What if we treated every correct answer not as the final destination, but as the starting point for a deeper, more interesting conversation? If we did that, we might just unlock a whole new level of learning and curiosity for every single student out there.